Good evening, everyone. For those of you who have not heard it from me yet, welcome to Government House. I hope you enjoy your evening this evening. So we have a wonderful, wonderful presentation at the start of a new series. This is a very exciting night. The one thing I want to do, though, to start is to go through a few little housekeeping rules so that we can enjoy this event as much as possible. So for those of you who need them, there are washrooms to the rear, so just through that back door, and they're along the left-hand side wall. Please stay to that side. Please turn off your cell phones. We would greatly appreciate that, so we do not want our presenter being interrupted. We are now on Facebook and Instagram, so if you have one and don't have the other, don't worry, we've got you covered. Please give us a follow and stay tuned for more information on our activities that are going on right here at Government House. And tonight's event was, we'll play it by ear depending on how the presentation goes, but I'll give you a little hint after we're done this evening. So, and as well, I'd just like to let everybody know that it is Her Honor's home. She lives in this big, beautiful building. And so we just ask that you would respect her space because, like I said, it is her home. All right, so those are the main points that I have to brief everybody on. And so at this point in time, I would like to ask all of you, if you are able, please rise for the arrival of Her Honor, the Honorable Anita Neville, Lieutenant Governor of Manitoba.
Please sit down. No, they're not here. Okay. Welcome, everybody. It's so nice to see you here this evening. Usually when we have an event like this at Government House, I always try and ask, how many have never been to Government House before? Oh, a lot. Well, I hope it's not your only time here and that you'll choose to come back many times. I want to welcome you to what I hope will be a transformative learning experience. I begin gatherings here at Government House by acknowledging and honoring that we are meeting in the heart of Treaty 1 land. And tonight I also acknowledge that this official residence of Manitoba's Lieutenant Governors is just 5 kilometers from the Assiniboia Residential School, which operated from 1958 to 1973 on Academy Road. As the ancestral and present-day home of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Dakota, the Dene, the Inuit, and Red River Métis peoples, and as a place where so many children and families have experienced the harm of the residential school system, Manitoba is truly the natural location for the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. Given that I often say in my acknowledgements before events that we must listen and learn in order to work for healing and reconciliation, this speaker series is an opportunity to support that learning and build that awareness, and most importantly, inspire action. We are very excited to put this series on here tonight. And we're very fortunate to be able to draw on the resources of expertise and experience that the NCTR has built since the establishment in 2015. In this series, we'll explore the history of Canada's residential schools, their impact on families and communities, the intergenerational traumas they caused, and the ongoing legal challenges. We will explore racism and stereotyping, efforts to deny the impact of residential schools, and the path forward as outlined in the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the United Nations Universal Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Tonight, we're fortunate that Kaila Johnston, the Director of Education outreach, and public programming at the NCTR will get us started by focusing on the history of Canada's residential schools. There may be uncomfortable times ahead. The subjects we'll discuss are difficult, but there will be opportunity to find pathways forward. I hope that in the months ahead, Manitobans will come to this series of events with open minds and open hearts, and together kindle new hope for a better and more just province and country for everyone. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of the speakers who will take part in this, and all of the staff members of the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation who worked to make this possible. And I want to give a particular thank you to Kate from my office, who has put in endless amount of time to make this happen. And I thank all of you for expressing your desire to learn, to heal by coming out tonight. I hope the series will be important to you. I hope you will come back to other lectures. Thank you for being here this evening. Merci, miigwech, and shalom.
Okay, so now we have the exciting part of the presentation. No offense, Your Honor. I'd like to invite Kaila Johnston to come forward and provide us with her presentation.
Hello and good evening. I always have a hard time at events due to my size, actually, but it looks like this is a good height for me, and my voice is being carried very well, so I want to thank Government House for ensuring my own comfortability here. Usually I have to wear my feet extenders or my big heels to make sure I can reach. So before I venture into the presentation itself, I first like to introduce myself a little bit more so you know who's up here talking about the subject with you. So I have just a couple of slides exploring a little bit more about who I am, where I come from. So the images that you see up on screen are of my dad's side of my family. He was born in 1947 and came from farming stock that settled near Fork River between Dauphin and Winnipegosis. And so he's a descendant from immigrants that arrived in Canada between 1847 and 1901. So you see a collection of my parents and grandparents with family members coming from the British Isles, which include Ireland and England, but also family coming from what was then known as Galicia, now Ukraine, and those are the Mashowskis and Kotlachuks, as well as from the British Isles, the Bashams and the Johnstons. So I've mostly known more about my dad's side of the family, whereas my mom's side of the family was a little bit more of a mystery to me. So this is a collection of photos from my mother's side of the family, and that includes my great-grandparents and grandparents, who are the Alleries and the Pelches, and I descend from Swampy and Plains Cree, Saulteaux, as well as Métis families across Saskatchewan and Manitoba. So I am a storyteller. I love telling stories, and I got to tell some of these stories in my previous visit to Government House to talk about this series and to talk about what I'll be sharing about today. And so the collection of images you see up on screen are of the residential schools connected to my family's history. 3 are in the Qu'Appelle Valley, which are Qu'Appelle, Round Lake, as well as Maryville. And then 1 is located in Alberta, known as Crowfoot. So I'm an intergenerational survivor. My mother attended residential school, as did her siblings, parents, grandparents. And so growing up, I did get to hear some of those stories and experiences directly from my mother and those who passed those stories on to her. But I also worked as a statement gatherer for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. So this photo is a group photo of the statement gatherers, senior archivists, and statement gathering personnel at the final event in Ottawa in June of 2015. As a precursor, there were over 158 personnel who worked within statement gathering, but due to a number of factors like vicarious trauma and the inconsistent work, out of the original 25 of us trained, only 2 of us actually made it through the full commission, myself and one other, Barb Cameron, who's now one of our Survivor Circle members. And so growing up, I got to hear those stories and experiences, and through university and onwards, I got to hear those experiences firsthand from survivors, their family members, and communities as well, working for the TRC. I then moved over to the NCTR. So when it comes to the NCTR, I'm not going to dive too deep into it into this session, but we are the permanent safe home for all of the documents, statements, and physical objects collected by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission during its mandate. We are here to serve 5 components. 1 are survivors and their families to ensure that they have access to this history. The second is our educators, so they can share this material in the classroom with their students. We're also here to ensure that our researchers can dive deeper into the mysteries that exist. And in every single presentation I give, I always refer to Dr. Ian Mosby's work on the nutritional experiments that he uncovered in 2013. So I do recommend taking a look at that article. Now the last 2 pieces, the history and the public, I usually intertwine those. We're here to ensure that we can help foster healing and reconciliation by providing access to this content, while ensuring that this history and legacy are never forgotten or repeated. Now, as already mentioned, I have a difficult content warning. Hearing about traumatic experiences is inherently traumatic. So please take care of yourselves this evening. Some forms of self-care include decompressing by yourself, taking a short walk and being in nature, doing something that relaxes you, like getting massage or going for yoga, going somewhere quiet to reflect, processing information with friends or family, or even watching a film or TV show or podcast. Find something that works for you. So it's important to remember to just please look after yourself after this session. My second warning up there is related to antiquated language. Sometimes in records we come across words like Indian and Eskimo, which are no longer used today. These outdated terms are important because they give us a greater understanding of the context of how Indigenous people were perceived at the time of that record's creation. So today, the use of those terms are considered to be disrespectful, derogatory, harmful. There will be instances in my presentation where I will be using those terms to describe Indigenous peoples. However, outside of direct quotes or referring to documents, I'll be using the terms Indigenous, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. Now, I believe this is my last little section here of notifications and warnings, and that's connected to health support. So mental health support is important when it comes to our statement gathering work, but also through our presentations. And so if you do need immediate emotional support, there is the National Indian Residential School Crisis Line, as well as the Indian Residential School Survivor Society Crisis Line. And those numbers are 1-866-925-4419. There is also the Hope for Wellness line at 1-855-242-3310, but there's also the online chat at hopeforwellness.ca. There's the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Crisis line at 844-413-6649. And lastly here, there is the Suicide Crisis Helpline at 988, as well as the Wellness Together lines. And so the Wellness Together lines can be done through telephone as well as text at 1-866-585-0445. Now up on screen, I have an image of a residential school, one of the biggest, largest in Canada. This is the former residential school in Kamloops. Now, when it comes to residential schools, they were a network of boarding schools primarily aimed at First Nations treaty status children. However, these institutions also took in non-treaty status children, Inuit and Métis children. It's estimated that over 150,000 children attended these institutions, many of them experiencing poor treatment, which I'll be covering today. Now, when it comes to the creation of these institutions, well, residential schools were funded and run by the Canadian federal government, as well as Christian churches like the United Church and Catholic Church. But it's also important to recognize that there are a great number of unrecognized institutions that were run simply by the provinces or territories or by the churches alone. Some schools were very large, like Kamloops here, which at one point in time had over 500 students living there in the 1950s. But there were other schools much smaller than that, like Round Lake, and at its peak in the 1940s had 77 students living there. Now, the image I just put up on screen, you probably have seen before. It's on a lot of materials connected to residential school history, and it's a before and after picture taken of Thomas More Cusick as he appeared when he entered the Regina Indian Industrial School in 1891. Now, but by the time that these images were published in the Indian Affairs Report in 1897, Thomas More had already passed away due to contracting tuberculosis at the institution. Now, these images are propaganda-based pieces meant to depict the transformation children would go through attending the residential school system. Now, the Canadian government and the churches said that the role of the residential school system was for the purpose of removing children from the influence of their culture, family, and community, and to better assimilate them into Canadian culture. Now, of course, when put into practice, these ambitions translated into a direct attack on Indigenous culture, language, spiritual beliefs, and practices. Now, just to highlight the propaganda-based piece, if you take a look at Thomas on the left-hand side as he's dressed in regalia, he's actually holding a little gun. He's posed in front of a buffalo robe. And what academics have said is that that clothing is actually not his clothing. That's women's clothing they've dressed him up in just prior to going to that school. And it's a little hard to see based upon the graininess of these photos, but you can kind of see the tip of his plaid shirt peeking through from that regalia. Comparatively, Thomas on the right-hand side, his hair is cropped short. He's wearing a military-style uniform, very popular at this time at reformatory schools and industrial schools. And even if you look at Thomas's face from one photo to the other, it feels like the second photo has been overexposed or brightened. Now, when it comes to the residential school system, oftentimes you hear the quote that the schools were created to kill the Indian and the child. I actually don't like that quote, and that's because it's a misquote. It comes from the United States, but I understand why it's used. It's very evocative, and it speaks to the cause, the reason of the school system here. Instead, I like to use a quote by the fellow that you see pictured behind me. This is Duncan Campbell Scott, who was the Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs. I found children as young as 1 and 2 years old in these institutions and as old as 23. Now, by 1931, we reached peak number of residential schools with 80 schools operating at one time that are recognized under the settlement agreement. Now, although the number of schools recognized decreased over the years, the number of students actually increased due to the impacts on families today. Church involvement was reduced in 1969 when the federal government took over the majority of operations. And although the residential schools had started to wind down, it wouldn't be until 29 years later that they finally wound down for good and closed in the 1990s. Now you see I have a couple different dates tentatively there of when did the last residential school close? Well, that's a difficult question. It also is difficult on how many residential schools were there. It just depends on how you're looking at it through a particular scope. If we look at the settlement agreement or the URSA agreement, that recognizes 140 schools. We recognize 141 at the center. And if we include the schools from Newfoundland and Labrador, that brings it up to 146. But then again, that does not include all of those institutions that did not have federal government involvement. Now, when it comes for the last year of the school closing, you often hear 1996. However, there was a school later added to the settlement agreement that bumped it up to 1997. I like to use 1998, as that was the year LeBret closed. And although it was no longer operating as a residence, it was a former residential school, which is why I included it on my list here. Now, here is a map of the recognized residential schools under that settlement agreement. You'll see primarily it's focused in the prairie provinces. And this is a color-coded map. So the orange dots represent the Catholic-based institutions, yellow is Anglican, blue is United, and green is Presbyterian. But there's some unique colors on there too. So if you look towards Whitehorse, you'll see a purple dot representing the only Baptist school recognized in Canada. If you look to northwestern Ontario, those moss-colored are Mennonite-based schools. And through northern Quebec and in the north in general, that gray color are the non-denominational schools. Now here is the list of the 14 recognized residential schools here in Manitoba, excluding 3 schools that were not included, Middle Church, St. Boniface, and Waterhen. There are 7 Roman Catholic schools, 2 Anglican, 2 Presbyterian, 2 Methodist, and 1 non-denominational. Through that list, you can see that there are 222 recognized deaths recorded at these institutions. And the ones that have the second number, those are based upon ground penetrating radar or GPR-based research that have been done at those sites today. Now here is just a very quick look at a timeline when it comes to some important dates that I wanted to highlight. So you'll see in the 1800s, the early 1800s, we have the opening of the Mohawk Institute, but also referenced here are the Davin Report, which I'll talk a little bit more about. And what existed prior to the 1880s, as I mentioned, was not a system, but a series of those church-run institutions. But in 1883, the federal government began to build their own residential type schools, such as Capel, High River, and Battleford. But other notes that you can see up on screen include the government apology given by Stephen Harper in 2008, what I consider to be the official start of the TRC's activities in 2010, and then the close of the TRC and the opening of our center, the NCTR, in 2015. Now, as for the start of this system, I'm going to highlight 2 major reports. Because the system is so expansive, it's a little difficult to try and to condense it within 50 minutes, but I'm going to give my best here with some Manitoba-based examples. So when it comes to this specific report, the Ryerson report, this is connected to Ergeton Ryerson, who was the superintendent of schools in Upper Canada in 1844. And so his report reiterated an idea that was spurred in an earlier report that separating Indigenous children from their parents was a recommendation to ensure the greater assimilation of those children. It was also recommended that education focus on more of a religious aspect as well as agricultural training. Now, this model was actually proposed based upon the Howlif School for the Poor in Switzerland. And so you can see a little bit of a sample of the curriculum up on screen there, including geometry, natural history, writing, bookkeeping, and morals. Now, this moral aspect is actually influenced or follows through into the Nicholas Flood Davin report. Nicholas Flood Davin was a journalist, a lawyer, and a failed politician sent to the United States to take a look at the boarding school system down south. He traveled to Washington, met U.S. government officials, Indigenous peoples. He visited mission schools and met church and government officials. He advised the government forge a relationship or a partnership with the churches based upon 2 components. One, a moral one, and the second, an economic one. And the moral one was that if they were to remove those children from the influence of their communities, from their families, it would be immoral of them to replace what was lost without something better. That something better was Christianity. Now, the economic component was that these dedicated religious men and women would not mind so much getting paid substandard pay because they're already taking vows of charity. And so they don't have to pay them to the same amount as a provincial teacher. Now, the Indian Act's history is quite long and expansive, so again, I'm just going to pull out a few little pieces to highlight here. First one being the Indian Act contained no educational provisions until 1884, a full 8 or 10 years later, and there was no mention of residential schools until 1894. Now, other components related to the Indian Act was that if a parent or guardian did not send their child to school, they would be considered neglected, to which then an Indian agent could go and collect that child and place them in an institution until the age of 18. Now, parents and guardians not only could be arrested and fined, they could also have their rations reduced if they did not send their children to school. Now, when it comes to the enforcement of those policies, I had a magazine reach out and ask me about this, wondering when was the last time that those policies, say truancy policies, were enforced. And unfortunately, I did not have a good answer for them. They were still on the books in the year 2014. When it comes to their enforcement, I couldn't say when was the last time that they had children round up and brought to school, but it was still within the Indian Act up until just little bit more than a decade ago. And so when it comes to the experiences of students at residential school, I wanted to use some comments or some quotes directly from the students themselves before I show a specific Manitoba example. So when it comes to the residential school system, often we are focusing on the children. However, the TRC's tagline was "for the child taken and for the parent left behind." Albert Marshall, a survivor, shared his experience about hating his parents for sending him to the Shubenacadie school on the Atlantic coast. He asked his brother what the family reaction had been when they had sent him. And he said, "Nobody said anything for days because my father was crying every day." His father said, "I failed as a father. I couldn't protect my child, but I just couldn't because you know what the Mounties, the priests, and the Indian agents told me? They told me if I resist too much, then they would take the other younger children, the brothers and younger children. It was not a choice. I could not say take them or take the three of them, but I couldn't say nothing, and I know I have to live with that." Another aspect that you may not have expected, but there were arranged marriages held at residential schools. Violet Below, an orphan and survivor, shared her experience about her arranged marriage in 1953. "They had to get rid of me, I guess. Where are they going to send me? Because they had to set up a marriage for me, someone I didn't know. I brought a book to the priest and he said, 'Sit down, I want to talk to you.' So I sat down and he said, 'You're getting old.' So I thought I was getting old. And he said that I should be getting married. And so many guys came to see you and you refused. So next time somebody comes, you go out there and you're going to marry that guy." When it comes to education, these schools were substandard institutions, barely going beyond a grade 6 level education until after World War II. For Fred Kistabish, a survivor, he shared his experience at the Amos Residential School. He said there was a big blackboard that says, if you're a good boy, you're going to go to heaven. On the other side of the drawing there is, if you commit mortal sins, that's what you're going to go. And then you have Lucifer and hell, and it says always, always, forever. That's traumatizing for a 12-year-old or 15-year-old or 14-year-old. Anyway, when I left the residential school, I knew that if I died, I for sure was going straight to hell because I was disobedient, because there are things lacking in my childhood. As for food, it was pretty bad even in the best of times. And here is a quote from Basil Johnston, who attended the Spanish school in Ontario. He said it was mush, 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 sometimes lumpy, sometimes watery, monotonous regularity every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday. In fact, the Mohawk Institute was also known as the mush hole because of the porridge that was served as a staple for breakfast. When it comes for labor at residential school, I have a quote here from Andrew Speck, a survivor who shared his experience. He said, "Early in the morning, you're up at 5:30 or 6 o'clock because you had to go and do your chores before you had your breakfast. If you weren't up there, you were literally ripped out of the bed and thrown into a cold shower." Now, oftentimes I am asked, weren't there any good things about residential school? Were there any positives at all? And when we talk about positives or good things that happened at residential school, what that's connected to are friendships survivors made with each other, as well as means of escapism through sports programs, arts programs, drama, and dance, which were severely underfunded like the rest of the residential schools. So here I have a quote from Noelle Starblanket, a survivor who attended the Capel Residential School. He said, "I had some good moments, in particular at the sports side, because I really enjoyed sports. I was quite athletic, and basically that's what kept me alive. That's what kept me going, was the sports. I wanted to go back for the sports, and that was the only thing that I went back for." Now, this is the last slide before I move on to the experience that I'll walk you through with the Manitoba example, and this is connected to health. Now, during the program's first 50 years, tuberculosis and then influenza were the primary killers of children at residential school. The neglect, abuse, lack of food, isolation from family, and badly constructed buildings assisted in the killing of these children, or as Duncan Campbell Scott called them, the inmates. In a 1913 report, he said it was well within the mark to say that 50% of the children who attended these institutions did not live to benefit from the education they received therein. And when it comes to the number of deaths in these institutions, you're going to find a whole range, as low as 2,000 to as high as 10,000 or more. On our current memorial database that you can access on our website, we have identified 4,139 children, which is a mixture of named and unnamed children. And the reason for that mixture is that a third of records have no name, a fourth have no gender, half have no cause of death listed. Now note, when it comes to the records, we are still searching through the records that the TRC received, which includes about 3.1 million records. We are currently waiting to receive 23 million records from the federal government, which were not previously handed over to the NCTR. So those numbers we do expect to continue to rise as research continues to move on. Now this brings me to the Manitoba-based example I wanted to give, because for me, working with the archives is the most powerful component. When I talk about those numbers and those statistics, it can be very easy to get lost in the statistics and to be able to lose that humanity and to see each one of those numbers as an individual child or person impacted by the system. When I work with those records with students, when I get to pull out and talk about these, we can bring that humanity back by taking a look at that child's name and imagining what that experience was like. So in this case, this is a story of a young boy named Suzanyak who attended the Brandon Residential School and how he was impacted by both the residential school system, but also the segregated medical care system and the medical evacuation program of the northern communities to address the tuberculosis crisis. So this story uses a mixture of primary source documents from both the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, but also other repositories, such as the Manitoba Indigenous Tuberculosis History Project. So let's get a little bit of context. So this is connected to the Brandon Residential School, which was located approximately 3 miles northwest of the city of Brandon. Now, in its history, it was operated by the Methodist, the United, and the Catholic Church at different times, and it's in its final years. It operated as a residence only, so students were residing in the residence and being sent to public schools in the city of Brandon. Now, in 1972, the school was abandoned, and in the early 2000s, it was later demolished. And so you could drive out and you could go visit the rubble field that exists out there. Also connected to the school are 3 different sites of unmarked burials. There is current work being done to identify as many children as possible. From that number of that previous slide you saw, we can positively identify 74 children, but ground penetrating radar has identified 104 burial plots. Now, the Sioux Valley Dakota Nation has been working with research of their own accord and has identified 98 of those children, so there's still 4 or 5 children which need to be identified. Now, when it comes to who was the principal at this time, well, that was Reverend Oliver Bailey Strapp, who was principal from July 1944 to 1955. Reverend Strapp previously worked at the Mount Elgin Residential School in Ontario and later worked for the Edmonton Residential School until his retirement in 1961. For me, it's important to recognize that in 1960, we had the Edmonton food riot at the residential school that he was overseeing, so it does not surprise me that he retired less than a year later after that incident. Now, during his tenure at the Brandon Residential School, there were multiple complaints made about the treatment of the children, that they were undernourished, that there were many truants or runaways who were beaten. Parents from Saskatchewan refused to send their young boys there because they were not being looked after. Now, this became so bad that in 1951, the Department of Indian Affairs began a formal investigation into the treatment of those children, especially those runaway boys. Now, there were conflicts when it came to the investigation, as the investigator was not allowed to speak to any staff or student without the principal being present. Now, Reverend Bailey Strapp explained that this was needed to ensure that they were telling the truth. Now, that investigation was able to move ahead after the investigator threatened that he couldn't continue and he was going to get other individuals further involved, to which at that time he was then allowed to speak to 2 children without the principal being present. Those children reported that they did not have much time to play, that they had way too much work in the kitchen and farm, that they didn't have proper clothes to wear, that they didn't get enough to eat, and that they were no longer allowed to play games like baseball and hockey. The investigator concluded that dramatic changes would need to be made at the school if they were to solve this runaway problem, but by June of 1953, those discussions about replacing Reverend Bailey Strapp were only just beginning. It wasn't until 2 years later in 1955 that the United Church agreed to move him to another school instead. Now, when it comes to the catchment area for residential schools, here is a map showing 35 communities that had children in the residential school at Brandon. So the ones that you see circled are the ones that had the most amount of children taken. So starting in the north is God's Lake with 40 children. Moving closer to the Interlake are Fisher River with 30 and Pegwis with 19. If we move to southern Manitoba, we see 19 children coming from Oak Lake, but also 15 children coming from White Bear. And you'll notice those are children coming from Ontario, all across Manitoba and Saskatchewan. And the reason for this is that if your closest residential school to your denomination was full, they're going to send you to the next closest school that can hold you. But Catholic children are to attend Catholic institutions, Protestant children are to attend Protestant institutions, because there was much poaching that was going on in those early years. Now, one of the most common themes that were shared when it came to the residential school system was loneliness and isolation. Boys and girls were strictly segregated by gender based upon European norms, but also segregated from older and younger students. And although those attending were surrounded by hundreds of other students, it was in an atmosphere of fear, deprived of love, affection, and approval. So imagine, we're going to put ourselves into a small 6-year-old child. Not only do you have no siblings attending with you, you have no community members attending with you. How lonely might that trip have been to get to that institution, and how lonely might you feel if they don't speak the language that you do and that you must either learn English or French? Now, that loneliness was felt by a particular child in the residential school that I'll highlight, but here is a quote connected to loneliness. Beverly Ann Mitchell, a survivor, shared her experience, and she says, "I wasn't ever allowed to talk to my brothers, and I had 3 brothers there. 2 of those brothers committed suicide. It hurt not to be able to talk to them. I couldn't even talk to my sister, and she was on the same side as me. But she was a junior girl, and maybe if she had been an intermediate, I would have had more access to her." So up on screen, I've just pulled up a document known as a quarterly return. A quarterly return is filled out 4 times a year, and it's actually a financial document that's used to determine how much money the school was going to get based upon how long a student was attending that school. So how many days were they in residence and how many days were they actually in school, in the classroom. So this is a copy of the June 30th, 1950 quarterly return. There are 8 pages of this document, which lists 65 boys and 109 girls, with 170 students total, for the months of April, May, and June. The youngest child in this quarterly return was 5 years old, and the oldest was 19. And it had students from grades 1 to 11. So we're looking at page 2 of this document, the tail end of the boys. And there is one young boy listed, the final young boy that you see, number 677. Named Susanyak, who's 5 years old. He's a boy. He comes from Coral Harbor. He is in grade 1. His standing in class is fair. And moving over to the far side here, it says the date that he entered the school was May 10th of 1950. So he'd been in the residence for 51 days and 22 days in class. But there's this really interesting handwritten note. It says, admitted from the Brandon Sanatorium during the flood crisis to make way for evacuees from Winnipeg hospitals. He is not TB, band number E3-626. Now, looking at this information, we can immediately tell that he is different from the other students. If we start at his name, Susanyak, we see that it's a mononym. It's just a single name compared to the first and surnames for the other children on this list. Now, if we look at her Bander Reserve, and although it's a little hard to read, it says just above that, Esquimaux, written above Coral Harbor. Now, usually this is an engagement piece, which may be a little bit harder to do, but my question is, does anyone know where Coral Harbor is? Because the map I showed you was zoomed in. So this is the full map. Coral Harbor is located on Southampton Island. The distance between Coral Harbor or Salic and the Brandon Residential School is a whopping 1,875 kilometers. This is an exorbitant distance for a child to travel for education purposes. I can tell you, although there were limited residential schools in the north, there were closer institutions than Brandon. Now, the other piece I wanted to highlight was connected to his band number, E3626. This is actually his Eskimo disc tag number, or his Umajik, which was a system used to document the Inuit by the Government of Canada in lieu of surnames. The government had decided disc tags were needed because of increasing missionary work, trading, and government engagement with northern communities. So in this case, we see a boy named Billy was E6-935. Eventually, the disc tag system was replaced due to Project Surname led by an Indigenous man, an Inuit man who toured the Northwest Territories, as well as Northern Quebec, or Nunavik, between 1968 and 1971, with a linguist to change that system. Now, with that in mind, I was very curious as to why there was a young Inuit boy in a southern Manitoba residential school. What was he doing so far from home? So I continued to follow him through the quarterly returns. So the one that you see up on screen now is the September 30th, 1952 quarterly return. You can see they've upgraded to a typewriter. I very much appreciate that. Handwritten documents can be very difficult to read in the best of times, especially when they use artistic flourishes. And I can tell you, teaching youth these days with handwritten documents is very difficult, as they don't teach cursive in school anymore. So I need to actually transcribe all those documents for them to read it. So in this document, you see we follow him, 677 Susanyak. He's now 7 years old. He's still in grade 1. And I'm going to scroll over to that far side again, because there is a very interesting handwritten note. And this one says, returned home by Indiana Health Services, August 4th, 1952. With that in mind, Susanyak was an inmate at Brandon for 2 years and 3 months. Due to cost, policy, and distance, he would not have gone home during winter or summer breaks. He would have remained at the school until such time that he was released. So again, if we think about that isolation and loneliness, can you imagine what it would be like for you to be away from your closest family members for years at a time, and potentially what it might be like to return home to them? So why was he in the Brandon Residential School? How did he get there? How did he get back home? Well, this is connected to the Brandon Sanatorium. So the Brandon Sanatorium was constructed in the 1940s and was originally known as the Brandon Military Hospital. It was meant to take in returning soldiers from the Second World War, and in 1947, the hospital was turned over for the treatment of TB patients, for Indigenous patients. And so that's when the Department of National Health and Welfare had transferred it to the Sanatorium Board of Manitoba for First Nations patients, and then later Métis and Inuit patients. And so sanatoriums in Canada worked alongside the federally run Indian hospitals to manage the segregated medical care system we had in Canada. For sanatoriums specifically, they weren't built with Indigenous patients in mind, but at this time they had developed less invasive means of treating tuberculosis, such as antibiotics, which meant there were many open beds in these institutions which could then take in Indigenous patients. And due to racism and a number of other components to it, Indigenous patients were then used to fill the beds and experienced to, or I should say subjected to, very invasive procedures, such as the removal of ribs, the collapsing of lungs, the full body casts, as I mentioned, at a time when they had antibiotics. So this is what the institution looked like at the time. I can tell you there's nothing left behind in Brandon to show that this institution was there. It's now just a parking lot. Now, although I don't have a picture of Susanyak here, he probably looked a lot like this young boy that I have up on screen. This is a picture of Okatak, who was living at the Brandon Sanatorium up until 1956. And it just so happens he's also from the community of Coral Harbor. Here's a collection of other images of patients coming from the Brandon Sanatorium, including Okaitek, at which point in time in 1956 he'd been cleared from his diagnosis of tuberculosis and was allowed to return home again. So when it comes to the tuberculosis crisis of the North, it reached epidemic proportions by the 1940s. It had originally been introduced to Inuit and Dene communities in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and became such a problem that a committee for the control and prevention of tuberculosis amongst Indians was established to identify solutions. Well, instead of increasing the size of hospitals in the Northwest Territories or building new hospitals, they deemed the most important means of treating this was actually to send patients south from the north to communities to receive treatment in those institutions. So a medical evacuation program was established, and it operated for 23 years, between 1946 to 1969. The average stay for patients in a southern institution was 2.5 years, but some stayed for 10 years or longer. That length away in from community sometimes meant sometimes patients had a hard time readjusting back to life in their community because they lost important skills like language and cultural habits. Now, as for how did they get to Coral Harbor? Well, they used something called the Eastern Arctic Patrol. The Eastern Arctic Patrol followed the means of supplying Hudson's Bay trading posts with supplies. And so they sent specialized ships like the CD Howe and the RMS Nagascopy with nurses, doctors, x-ray technicians, and other individuals to visit these communities and to check whether there was presence of tuberculosis amongst community members. Patients would be brought on board these ships, and if the presence of tuberculosis was found, they would be detained and then brought south. So here is an image of the RMS Nagascopy, and in the initial year of this program, the quote from the Indian Affairs report was, "Within the limits imposed by the capacity of trained personnel and special equipment, surveys for tuberculosis were conducted across the country and in the Arctic. Some 1,500 Eskimo were x-rayed on the 1946 trip of the Nagascopy." Now, while some individuals were aware that they had a serious illness, many were diagnosed as asymptomatic, so there were no visible signs or symptoms of illness. And as a result, there was often much confusion as to why they were being taken from their homes and families. Even when they were aware of their condition, it wasn't always made known when they would be brought back or where they were being taken. And although the disc tag system was in operation at this time, in the north, the ITK, or the Inuit Taparit Katamani, advocates for the eradication of TB through community education and mobilization. So engaging, informing, and empowering the community to reduce incidence rates of TB. There's also the Nanilavut, or the Let's Find Them working group, that was formed to assist those wanting to find their relatives in southern communities by doing research, as well as providing compassionate funds to send them south, as well as means to take care of those cemetery sites. Now, I'm very cognizant of the time, so I'm jumping ahead a little bit to get to the section on Susanuk. So how did he get displaced? Well, there's a contextual aspect to it. In that quote, it says, admitted from the Brandon Sanatorium during the flood crisis. So what did we have in the 1950? Well, we had the Red River flood, one of the most detrimental floods that Manitoba has faced since the 1860s. So this is what downtown Winnipeg looked like. I do have an updated picture just so you can see how high the water was on the building. Now, there were 70 to 100,000 people evacuated from Winnipeg. We had 4 out of 11 bridges destroyed. 1 person had been killed and had caused $1 billion worth of damage in today's funds, and it's why we have the Red River floodway today. So when it came to how it impacted Susanyak, well, between May 8th and May 15th, there were 248 patients evacuated from Winnipeg hospitals, and so they were sent to other institutions, with 54 to 56 being sent to the Brandon Sanatorium and were given refuge there. Susanyak was admitted on May 10th, so right in the middle of the displacement of those patients. And because he was no longer impacted by tuberculosis, either he'd been treated or potentially was a false positive, he was transferred to the only institution that would accept him, a residential school. So what really happened to Susanyak? Well, unfortunately, I don't have him here today to tell me what his experience was like, or have his family to know what the true reason was. And while we might assume based on the information that it was connected to tuberculosis, there is another potential connection to another illness. So here is a record from the Indian Affairs Office that talks about Susanyak. I'm going to first scroll down to the bottom because there's this interesting quote here. And it says, Reverend Oliver Bailey Strapp is concerned about a young Inuit boy. He mentions that he has lost his language. He speaks English and Cree, and it's feared when it's time for him to come home at his discharge, he'll be a misfit amongst his community. It's recommended that another place more suitable be found for him. Now, this kind of contradicts what I started with at the beginning of the presentation. The aim of the residential school system was assimilation. But something I'll note when it comes to education around residential schools, primarily it's focused on Prairie Province First Nations experience. And we have to recognize there's a whole diversity of experiences, including Métis and Inuit experiences. And so for the Inuit experience, up working in the north means there is a lot less settler colonialism up there right now, which means he's going to need his cultural skills or his language in order to survive. Without those skills, he will be sent back south to live. He will be completely ostracized from his community. So in another version of this letter, there's this handwritten note right at the top, and it's very hard to read, but I'm going to read you a transcription of it. It says, Mr. Cantley, where can this boy be placed? It is apparent he is now a misfit and furthermore a responsibility of this administration. No doubt he was one of the polio patients from King George Hospital. So little did I know, in the winter of 1948 and 49, there was a major polio outbreak in the north which affected a number of eastern Arctic communities throughout the Northwest Territories. Through this graphic, P stands for paralyzed, D stands for death. So for example, in Chesterfield Inlet, there were 14 persons who died and 39 who were paralyzed. Polio had been introduced through a number of sources, through asymptomatic missionaries, as well as community members who then traveled to other communities passing along that illness. Originally, they did not think polio could ever make it to the north. How could it get there? They thought it was a new strain of measles. Well, with further research, they then realized, actually, yes, it's polio. So this is a recreation of a map published in October 1949 of the Canadian Medical Association Journal, showing the full impact of that outbreak. The most serious patients were evacuated to Winnipeg, Thunder Bay, as well as Ottawa. So what was the King George Hospital? Well, the King George Isolation Hospital was built in 1914 and was used to care for patients with communicable diseases. And so, of course, it treated those impacted by the great influenza epidemic of 1918 and the polio epidemic of the 1950s. As another example of Inuit community member impacted by polio, I have a A little short biography of Mark Kellogg, who was raised in the traditional Inuit lifestyle until he contracted polio and was sent south for treatment. He spent 4 years at the King George Hospital until he was allowed to return in 1952. Confined to his bed, he was taken for daily exercises in a futile attempt to rebuild his strength. A quote from him said, "For me at least, it didn't do the least bit of good and only resulted to annoy me." So during his time south here, he learned to read and write English and then flew back to his community in 1952, to which he said, "Oh, how truly wonderful it was to return home." He became a respected translator, teacher, and cultural consultant, as well as an author, and was named to the Order of Canada in 1990, and was one of the first recipients of the Order of Nunavut. So when it comes to, again, that question of what actually happened to Susaniuk, research to date has been unable to prove whether he was impacted by tuberculosis or polio. The reality is we may never know this answer. Both stories are possible based upon what we've explored in the documentation. So what do we do? Well, in this case and in many cases, what we do is use everything we know about the residential school system, about residential school history, the treatment of students. We take a look at the history of the treatment of Indigenous peoples in that medical care system to inform our thoughts. Now, with that, we may never come to know the truth, but we can come to a pretty close understanding of how the Canadian federal government and institutions like the residential school system and the healthcare system treated Indigenous peoples. Now with that, I did want to highlight one last thing before I close out, and that is I gave this presentation in August of this year at the RBC Convention Center for an event for survivors. And it just so happens there were individuals from Coral Harbor in the audience with me. Now, although I do not have the exact identity at this time, I tentatively have met a potential relative of Susaniuk, who then told me, Susaniuk is not an Inuit name. This is a made-up name, a mistranslation. It likely was based upon, instead of the letter S, the letter Q, because of course it's written in cursive with those fun flourishes. And so with that, they said, Susan is a girl's name. There's no boy named Susan up in the north. For this individual, they likely said that this is her Uncle Jimmy Snowball as his nickname, and it turns out he was impacted by polio and had been sent south to Winnipeg for treatment. So I'm not very comfortable doing cold calls, but I'm very happy to have made this connection to potentially determine in the end whether or not Jimmy Snowball here is our Susaniuk and what actually had happened to him. But this is a rare case. In most cases, our survivors are survivors, those who live long enough to talk about those stories and experiences. For many who attended residential school, it's the records that speak for them. And of course, they're coming from a very colonial lens. They're government and church documents. Abusers don't create records of abuse, so we need to use that critical eye when looking at these documents to get a better understanding. But with that, and I'll jump to my final slide here, which is contact information here. So if you would like to know more about Susaniuk's story, about other Manitoba-based stories, I have the emails for myself and my team in the education unit. If you're looking to find records for your own family history, I have our NCTR records email, as well as our general email, nctr@umanitoba.ca. And we encourage anyone to reach out who is looking for that education or information. Anything from how do I navigate the database to access these documents, to how do I watch a survivor's statement, to what are the calls to action and how do I engage in this kind of work. I only use publicly accessible materials in my presentations, and so with that you'd be able to get a full copy of Susaniuk's story and all the documents that I use if you reach out and are interested in that information. And I'm very happy to say you will get to hear me again in this speaker series when I talk a little bit more about contemporary history. So that is, who is the NCTR? Where did we come from? What was the TRC? How did that get established? And where are we going from there? So with that, I'm going to wrap up my talk. Thank you very much.
Floor is open to questions if anybody would like to ask.
I was going to ask, yeah, we have time for questions. So I see a hand right in the center. Yes, sir.
I was just wondering a couple of things. One is, you're using numbers of 150,000 residents, and seems to be, in relationship to 20 million people, it's rather insignificant. So what's the significance in relationship to the number of children that were alive, or the number of families that it's dealing with, or the population of the indigenous people at that time? Are we talking 10% of the population, 50% of the population that went into residential schools?
Very good question. I was kind of hoping someone would ask something like that. So when it comes to the research, 150,000 children, you're exactly right. It does seem kind of low. But keep in mind, loss and destruction of records, we'll never truly know that number. But based upon that number, it's estimated that it's about 30 to 40% of the population. Now, what that does speak to, though, is the intergenerational impacts, the legacy of the residential school system, and how detrimental it was to think, well, if it wasn't all the children, potentially what might have the impacts been if there were a greater number of children impacted by the system. And the same can be said when it comes to the statistics related to death. And so the closest statistic we could find, you were more likely to die in a residential school, 1 in 25 odds. That's based off of 6,000 children having died with 150,000 attending, compared to a soldier fighting in World War II, which was 1 in 26 odds. And so when it comes to those numbers and the stats, again, it can be a very difficult piece, but we gravitate towards stats because it gives us a little bit of a foundation to stand on to get an understanding of what that impact was and how detrimental that piece was. And so I'm adding more than what you asked here, but when it comes to the residential school system, it was really, really good at eliminating a person's ability to say, who am I? Where do I come from? What community do I belong to? So when it comes to addressing the intergenerational impacts, and there will be a speaker who is going to talk directly to that, oftentimes we see culture and language revitalization programs that give that opportunity for those impacted to answer those questions of, this is who I am, this is where I come from, this is where I belong. And we find that's a great way to address some of those impacts. Now I see a hand back there. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
When I went in, my older brother was supposed to go in. He was older than me, and I was 4 and a half. And he had a tantrum in the place where they were taking him in. And so the principal says, you can take him home. And then they asked how old I was. And then they took me in. I should have cried too. But my question is, like, you talk about that being like a government policy, but it wasn't enforced.
You are rightly to say it wasn't enforced. It all just depends who's in charge, what church is it, who is the principal, how full is the residential school. It's really up to those within the school to determine whether or not someone's getting admitted, discharged, whether they would admit children, as I said, babies at 1 and 2 years old, or have students who are as old as 23. That student who was 23 was living in residence and doing a business course in college. For those babies, oftentimes I see it's something that's impacted the community, where the parents or extended family members were unable to care for the child. I've seen children adopted out through this system, but I've also seen them go back to the home community throughout the quarterly returns, and I've looked at every single quarterly return on the public archive, so that's over 2,000 pages of material. Routinely, I've seen children at 4 or 5 years old, lower than that age of tentative admission. Supposedly, there were supposed to be physical examinations given to every one of the children being entered into the school to prevent the spread of illness. I can tell you they did not have access to physicians or nurses to give physical exams to determine whether or not they were healthy enough to be admitted. What was really about is the funds. Do we have maximum enrollment to get the most amount of funds so we can keep operating? Whether or not those children were of the proper age, proper community, or facing any sort of illness. Thank you. I see there was a question on this side as well.
I was almost wondering if it may come up later in the series, but was there a single event or a series of events that made the white population aware of what was happening in residential schools?
That's a good question. So was there a single event or a series of events that really kind of brought to mind the traumas that were occurring in residential school. And I'm trying to think, that might be included in my next talk because I give a little bit of a lead up to the settlement agreement, but I will say, starting from the 80s onwards, we have institutions beginning to offer apologies, such as the United Church. They gave the first apology in 1986. It wasn't an apology about residential schools, it was an apology about the violent nature of missionary work. The connection to residential schools would come in 1998. But throughout the 80s, we had more and more survivors start to come forward in public forums discussing what their treatment was like in institutions. I'd say that one of the biggest key components was in 1990, Phil Fontaine went on CBC to talk about his treatment at the Fort Alexander School here in Manitoba and to discuss his desire to meet with the Archdiocese of St. Boniface to discuss a public inquiry into the treatment of children. And so once we get to the 90s, that's when there were exploratory dialogues being held between the churches, survivors, and the government to discuss how to address the increasing litigation that was coming through. And I do see a hand, so I'm going to finish up my thought before coming. But in 2001, there were 8,500 lawsuits. Just 4 years later, that jumped between 18 and 20,000 lawsuits. And if every single survivor alive went through the formal court system at that time, would have frozen our formal court system, would have bankrupted the country, 80,000 survivors. And so a settlement agreement to address all outstanding litigation was seen as the most appropriate action, given the Blackwater versus Pliant Supreme Court case that occurred in 2005 that saw in favor of the Blackwater plaintiffs. So I saw a hand right in the center. Yes, please.
Can you tell if your archive also includes information about the St. Boniface Industrial School and other schools that perhaps weren't included in the TRC, but that also have important truths to gain, or where we can find that information?
So the question was, does our center hold records related to, I guess, unrecognized residential schools? And I'll give you the soft, tentative answer as yes, because we also collect data related to children who died in those other institutions as well, with the idea being eventually we hope to expand our mandate to include records related to unrecognized schools as well as other colonial systems. Due to funding and other means, our main focus are connected to schools related to the settlement agreement. But if we don't have those specific records, we can at least provide you the connection to the right repository, whether it is the Archdiocese of, Archdiocese of St. Boniface or Rupert's Land or one of the other repositories, maybe Library and Archives Canada. We can at least point you in that right direction. And when it comes to other colonial systems, as I mentioned, we're waiting on 23 million records for residential schools. We're also waiting on 6 million pages connected to federal day schools as well. So those will be coming in the next 2 years. Now I see a hand at the very back. Yes.
This is not as much a question, but also just on the topic of the St. Boniface Industrial School. There's a number of research being led by community members, and lots of that is held by the St. Boniface Historical Society. And there are active community members working towards that. And St. Boniface specifically has the name of over 70 children who passed away in the school.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for sharing that information. There are lots of repositories all across Canada that have little kind of stacks of work in it. There's also a lot of work being done directly by communities. Unfortunately, our center can't do it all, so what we do is support communities as best we can, such as working with them to develop memorandums of understanding, to basically take away the middleman of doing the research of the work to get those researchers directly into the archive to pull the records that they need to do that research, whether it's on missing children or unmarked burials or other connections related to that residential school connected to their community. Suffice to say, there's no shortage of work, and there's a lot of work that's being done by a lot of communities who are really taking control, or of course, when I want a really big important word, that's when it's left my mind. Giving back agency to communities in order to do this work, so they don't always have to rely necessarily on these experts when they can actually be the ones doing the work themselves and actually being the holders of that information as well. So I'm doing a quick look. I don't see any more questions, so I'm going to hand the podium back. Thank you very much.
I would really like to give my sincerest thank you for that presentation. It was extremely informative to be able to walk through someone's young life through records and how you demonstrated that. It was very authentic. So, you know, you can honestly feel what these children went through. I really, really appreciate that, Kaila. At this time, I'm going to invite everybody to join us for a nice light beverage and refreshments in the dining room. So this basically concludes the end of the formal part of this, and there will be more opportunity for discussion and talking and asking questions in the dining room. But I very much thank everyone for their attendance and for their questions. Just so you know that we're very aware that this is going to continue, and so the next topic will be unconscious bias and debunking stereotypes with a guest speaker, Dr. Carrie Miller, and it will be hosted on April 17th. The registration for this event will start on April 3rd, so please watch for your news releases, and you should be able to find out about it through Facebook and through the Instagram. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a good evening. And one last little housekeeping pointer. So the event will end at 8:45.